Welcome, everyone. My name is Jean DeMarco. I'm Chair of the Wildlife Committee. Our speaker this afternoon is Allison Meredith from the Wildlife Center of Virginia in Waynesboro. She has a degree in conservation biology and has been at the center since April. This afternoon, she's going to talk about the bear cubs that the Wildlife Committee has sponsored for Lake Monticello. If you recall, last year we sponsored the possum Marigold, and Marigold came in person so we could meet her. The bear cubs are not coming in person, but we're very happy to have Allison, and I'll turn the program over to her.
Yay. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. As you already know, my name is Allison, and I'm really excited to be accompanied today by one of my coworkers, Kavya, who is a wildlife rehabilitator at the center. And so they actually work hands-on with the bear cubs. Unlike me, I just do education programs and work with our education animals. So they'll be able to offer some really, really great insight into just the bears themselves and what working with them is like. But just a quick disclaimer before we get started, we are going to do our best to keep this program to about an hour. Quite frankly, we could both talk about bears for hours and hours and hours, but we are going to try to respect everybody's time and not do that today. But also to help us out with just keeping this going in a timely manner, we ask that you hold all of your questions until the very end, and then we will get to questions if you all have any. But otherwise, just a quick land acknowledgement that this program is being presented on occupied territory of the Monacan and Monohoic peoples. So just again, going over a little bit about us, my name is Allison Meredith and I am the outreach coordinator at the Wildlife Center. So like I said before, I do our education programs and I work with our education ambassador animals so they can come out to programs like this. And I'll let Kavya introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Kavya. I'm one of the 3 rehabilitators at the Wildlife Center of Virginia, and so we try to minimize the contact with the bears as much as possible so that they can be released into the wild without getting too used to humans. And so I'm one of the team of 4 people that does exclusively all of the handling and working with the bears. And so really excited to come and share their stories with all of you today.
So I'm sure all of you are fairly aware of who we are and what we do, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the Wildlife Center before we move on to the bear cubs. So we are a hospital for native wildlife, and I think it was already mentioned before that we're located in Waynesboro, so about 45 minutes or so from here. But we are a hospital for native wildlife, which means that if anybody finds an animal that they think is injured or sick or orphaned, like it lost its parents, then people can bring those animals to our hospital, where we have a whole veterinary team and then a whole rehabilitation team that works tirelessly to release these animals back into the wild. And so that is our whole goal, is to release any animal that comes into our hospital back into the wild. Of course, that isn't always possible for some animals, in which case we can make some of those animals education ambassadors. But the grand majority of animals that come through our doors, they are wild animals, and we want them to return to the wild and live their best wild lives. But it's also important to note that we are a nonprofit organization, which means that we don't get any government funding or any government monetary support. So we are by no means your tax dollars at work, that we are a independent organization that basically runs off of donations from kind individuals. So that can be members of the public, it can be other organizations, and that sort of thing. But we don't receive any kind of government funding, which is very important to note. And we are also a teaching hospital, which means that we have students coming in all the time that are helping us rehabilitate and treat these wild animals, but it also provides them a really, really great opportunity to get some hands-on experience with wildlife, since that is, as I'm sure you know, not the most common experience to be able to get. So we're very glad that we're able to just provide some exposure to individuals that are interested in working hands-on with wildlife or just learning more about wildlife medicine and that sort of thing. And the last thing to note is that we also have a very active outreach and education department. So we go out all the time and do education programs. As you all are aware, we do programs like this where it's a presentation, and we also bring our education ambassador animals out to meet everybody, and we kind of teach people about their stories and what has gone on with them, because all of our ambassadors were once patients in our hospital. So they do a really great job of just providing an example of animals that come through our hospital on a daily basis and just sort of talking about the issues that wildlife face, since there are so many issues that wildlife face nowadays. Now moving on to the cubs. So just a quick overview. We do generally begin expecting as well as oftentimes admitting cubs as early as February. Technically it's as early as January, but we make sure that we have everything in place by February at the very latest. And generally speaking, the earlier a cub comes in or the younger it is on admission, then there is a higher chance that we would be able to do something called wild fostering, which is something that I will expand on a little bit more later. But essentially it is placing these orphaned bear cubs that come in while they're still essentially infants, placing them with a wild mother that can care for them out in the wild so they never have to get that exposure to people. And we have thankfully had really good success rates with that sort of thing. So that is a really awesome thing that I think we're able to do, that we're able to coordinate with state officials to execute. But if we don't do a wild fostering situation, then these cubs are raised and cared for by our center's rehabilitators. And I just want to mention that there are very strict protocols in place in terms of who is allowed to do pretty much anything with the bears, even just, pulling medications for them potentially. That, like Kavya mentioned before, there are only 4 people maximum that are able to do anything in regards to the bears. If anything else is done, then the bears need to be completely sedated, just for safety concerns. But especially in terms of interacting with humans, there are only no more than 4 individuals that are allowed to interact with the bears in any way. And that is just to prevent habituation, which is basically just wild animals getting too comfortable around humans, which is of course something that we want to avoid when we're rehabilitating them, because it will be very alarming to have a wild animal come up to you and be like, hey, feed me. So we have these protocols in place to prevent that sort of thing from happening, since we especially don't want those types of run-ins happening with bears. But this year we have 7 bear cubs at our center, and so that is 4 males and 3 females. We've had less and we've also had more. It really just depends on the year. There kind of isn't much of a predictable pattern, but we've ended up with 7 bear cubs this year in particular that are at least currently at the center. And just a bit of an overview on what happens when we get a call on a black bear or some type of communication expressing a concern for a black bear. Black bears are entirely managed by the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and so they are the ones that have to determine if a bear needs to come in for care or anything like that. And so if you ever try to call us with information on a bear, we're going to say, great, thanks for letting us know, but you need to talk to DWR first, because they're the ones that have to give us permission to do anything with bears in Virginia. And so that is pretty much what happens, is that DWR is going to address any black bear concerns, whether it's an orphan or a deceased bear or anything along those lines. And then if DWR determines that a bear needs medical attention or needs to be raised by a rehabilitator, then they will contact us at the Wildlife Center, since we are actually the only facility in Virginia that is permitted to rehabilitate black bears specifically. So if a black bear is found anywhere in the state of Virginia, Virginia, and it ends up needing medical attention or help in any way, then it comes to the Wildlife Center of Virginia. It doesn't go anywhere else. And then we, of course, will care for the bear in whatever way that it needs. And then DWR is also going to coordinate and execute the release of the bear. And so that includes planning where the bear is going to be released to, sort of scouting out those release areas, and also monitoring them after release as well. And so when we admit cubs to the Wildlife Center, once again, we have to have explicit permission from the Department of Wildlife Resources before we can admit a black bear cub to our center. But when that does happen, we do have a very strict, again, cub triage protocol, which includes one veterinarian, one technician, and one rehabilitator. So you can sort of see that in this picture here, where we only have 3 individuals that are working on the bear. And like I mentioned before, that is going to be the case until the cub is entirely sedated, in which case other people can join in and do things that need to be done, but the cub has to be completely sedated before that can be done, to just minimize stress, just minimize general exposure. And we are going to do a very, very, very thorough physical exam. And so not only is that going to include an exam by one of our veterinarians, just kind of checking over their entire body to check for injuries or any abnormalities, but it is also going to include radiographs or x-rays, as well as blood work. And then we also do skin scrapes, since mange is a pretty common thing in black bears in Virginia as well. So we just want to make sure that the bears that come in don't already have those existing issues on top of whatever the reason for their admission was. And then once we finish up that exam, they are going to be moved to whatever the most appropriate, very secluded housing is. And this is sort of going to depend on the cub's age and just developmental stage and that sort of thing. So that part will vary depending on the situation as well. Actually, on Valentine's Day of this year, we had admitted our first 3 bear cubs of the season. And so these are a few pictures of those guys. You can see they're itty bitty, and they were all weighing between 1 to 2 pounds. And so really the same size as a large potato. Like you could hold them in a single hand. They were that small. And they were admitted because their den site was destroyed by some construction activity, unfortunately, and the construction workers that were there for the event, they did witness the sow, or the mother bear, retreating and running away. And once the Department of Wildlife Resources was contacted, they sort of stayed in the area to monitor and make sure that the mother bear wasn't going to return for her cubs, and she unfortunately did not. And so after that waiting period, all 3 of these cubs were transferred to us at the Wildlife Center of Virginia. And so they got those very thorough physical exams and workups done that I mentioned before. And then they were all housed together in an incubator, since they were still a little too young to be regulating their own temperature by themselves entirely. And they were also fed formula around the clock. So this means that our rehabilitation team had to be there at pretty much all hours while these cubs were in care. Kavya, do you know the exact hours that our rehabilitation team was having to be at the center to make sure these cubs were getting fed?
They were, so these 3 cubs came in just before I started at the Wildlife Center, but I do know that basically they were doing 2 overnight feeds. So we have shifts outside of baby season of 8 to 6, and then one person was coming in at, I believe, like 10 or 11, and another person was coming in at 2 or 3 in the morning to make sure that they were getting the kind of round-the-clock feeding that they needed.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that context was given, because this was a very, very intensive process. These were thankfully candidates that we were able to wild foster, but unfortunately, when their den site was destroyed, one of these cubs did gain a very, very deep laceration on one of its hind legs. So basically just a very deep cut, as well as a very painful fracture to its other hind leg. And we did keep this bear in care. We gave gave it lots of medications to, try and prevent any pain. And we, of course, gave appropriate bandaging and stabilization to try and encourage some healing in those injuries. But unfortunately, after a little less than a week, it was determined that this cub's injuries were not healing, and if anything, they were worsening, and it was just in a very painful state overall. And essentially, the injuries were so severe that even if this cub was able to recover in some way, it would have extremely limited mobility and sensation in its back legs. So it would not have been able to live a normal life in the wild or in captivity. And that raised some pretty significant quality of life concerns for us. And so sadly, this really is the last resort option that we do, but we did determine that the best course of action here was humane euthanasia for this cub, which I want to be clear, that is never the option that we want to go for first, but it was the reality in this situation. And at the end of the day, it was actually the best scenario for the specific cub just due to the severity of those injuries. And so we wanted to make sure that we could provide it with a peaceful passing rather than continuing on in pain. Now on to happier things. Thankfully, the other two cubs were perfectly fine. I don't think they had any injuries, or at the very least were very, very, very minimally injured. And so we cared for them, and then the Department of Wildlife Resources was able to locate a couple of den sites where there was an active sow or mother bear with cubs that were approximately the same age as these cubs, and so they were considered wild fostering candidates. And so on February 29th, representatives from the Department of Wildlife Resources came to this wildlife center and picked up the remaining two cubs and took them off to their journeys and everything. They did visit the first den site, and typically what they'll do is they will actually sedate that mother bear just to perform a general physical exam on her as well as her cubs to make sure that they're all in good health and that they are in fact a good candidate for wild fostering. I don't remember what exactly the issue was with the first mother bear. I want to say that it was actually her cubs were a little more developed than the DWR officials realized initially, and so they sort of deemed her and her cubs not the best candidates for this wild fostering situation. But then they went to that second potential foster mother, and they didn't even need to sedate her because they were able to very clearly see that she was very, very healthy and that her cubs were just the right age for this wild fostering situation. And so the Department of Wildlife Resources were able to place the remaining two cubs in the care of this mother, and then they checked in shortly after and confirmed that she was in fact caring for them as if they were her own. And so that is always the best outcome that we can hope for. It's very, very exciting. And I will also say that a few months later, the Department of Wildlife Resources witnessed the mother bear and all of her cubs, including the fostered ones, coming out of the den. So they are very, very likely living their lives just out in the wild, living their best lives at this point. So that is the outcome that we always hope for, and we're really, really excited about that. Moving on to our current bear cubs that we have in our care right now, I'm going to let Kavya take it away since they're going to be able to say a little more about the bears specifically.
Yeah. So these are a couple photos within the first week when OG, who you guys might all know from the cameras as Double Green, came into our care. He was admitted on March 15th. There had been an active brush fire that had disturbed his den site and had to be rescued from that. He came in a little bit, almost 6 pounds in weight, and because he was a single guy, we housed him indoors in one of the Zinger crates that Allison will talk to you a little bit more about, and started bottle feeding him. And as you'll see, being alone for a short amount of time until we got more bears definitely sort of got him used to us as being his bear moms, and he got really attached to his bottle feeding and his playtime every day out in his little enclosure.
Just to sort of address the housing and feeding situation at this point in time, like Kavya mentioned, this cub was housed in what we refer to as a Zinger crate, which is the crate pictured on the slide here. And this is typically going to be for cubs that are less than 3 kilograms. We always weigh our animals in grams or kilograms, but the equivalent of that is going to be about 6.5 pounds. So this cub was just the right size for that. And this specific cub was housed in indoors in our center's infant care unit, or ICU. And again, like Kavya said, he was fed formula from a bottle or a syringe, so you can see the sort of process going on there in that picture. And that was going to be somewhere between 3 and 4 times a day. This formula is a very high protein, low fat formula that is specifically made for omnivores, which is what black bears are. So very, very appropriate formula. And since this cub was alone initially, our rehab team did have to do a lot of work that I think I was told that it's about an hour to an hour and a half of dedicated, essentially playtime every single day. And this is not what you probably picture of us being like, oh, Gucci, Gucci, goo, cute bear cub. This is our rehab team going in and encouraging the cub to explore the room, and they provided different objects that the cub could play with to sort of get that play stimulation like it would with its siblings in the wild. So this wasn't us necessarily playing with the bear cubs, that if the cub came up to one of the rehabilitators and was very clearly trying to play with the rehabilitator, then they would redirect the cub to play with an object or just in a different area of the room entirely, so that way it wouldn't think that playtime was with humans. So that's sort of an example of the strict protocols that I was mentioning before about how we are trying to prevent habituation or imprinting even on humans in these bear cubs, since again, that would be a very, very huge problem out in the wild. And then we have a little video. So this is Green Tags, or OG, that first bear cub kind of playing on his own. You can see that there are some natural objects included in there, like a little log and some leaves. And you can see that the rehabilitation team is encouraging the cub to kind of play with the leaves and kind of tossing the leaves at him to encourage that play behavior without it being directly associated with a human. And then another thing to mention is that we also provide the bear cubs with what we call mush bowls, which is kind of exactly how it sounds. It's a bowl of different mush, but it's going to be a blend of soft fruits. And so I know with this group, this year's group in particular, they really enjoyed berries in their mush bowls. And so our rehab team provided lots of berries in the mush bowls, but it's also going to have some baby food, like the little, cans of baby food that you feed your human babies, a little bit of that, and some soaked dog food, as well as that formula. And really the purpose of the mush bowls is to help wean the cubs off of the formula, but also to encourage those self-feeding behaviors and just sort of introduce some solid food, since of course up until this point they're consuming only liquid formula. This is just kind of to help the cub start learning that it needs to feed itself rather than be fed.
This is a photo, or a couple of photos, of the second bear cub who came into care, who we all call Little, or Little OG, and you guys might know as double orange tags. He's also a male and came in about a week and a half or 2 weeks after OG came in. He was separated from his mother, and a DWR was unable to get the mother to come back, similar to those first cubs that Allison was telling you all about, and came in slightly smaller than OG. In fact, with a significant enough difference that when we put them together initially, we didn't have to tag them because we could visually tell them apart pretty easily. So we were really excited to get him in so that he and OG could be friends after, of course, the quarantine period that we put them through to make sure that they didn't have any of those mange and they had gotten the prophylactic deworming and things like that. And then he became OG's little brother, little guy that they could hang out together.
Pretty much the day after the second cub arrived, the rehabilitation team did move both of the cubs into an outdoor enclosure that we call large mammal isolation, or LMI for short. So from this point forward, I'm going to refer to it as LMI. But this is going to be for cubs between 3 to 10 kilograms. So when they're not just little itty bitty tiny babies anymore, but they're still babies and need to be monitored and stuff, we have lots of cameras set up in there for that specific purpose of being able to monitor the cubs in there. And so on March 28th of this year, both of those cubs were moved to LMI and then introduced in those Zinger crates. And initially when they're moved to LMI, they're going to be housed in the Zinger crates and then basically have supervised playtime with each other with a rehabilitation team member present. So that's just to monitor that the two cubs are actually getting along, that they're not hurting each other, but also to make sure that the cubs aren't injuring themselves by accident, because we do try to provide lots of climbing structures in here and lots of very soft bedding on the ground as well to prevent any kind of injuries from happening. But also these cubs are still learning how to climb and how to sort of go about life as a bear and everything. We have to take some safety considerations into account during this time. And so until essentially the cubs can be trusted to not injure themselves unsupervised, they are only in the large enclosure part itself, supervised with a rehab staff member present. And we do also have a couple of videos for here as well. So they're a little tiny, but hopefully you can see this is just a very quick clip of a little bit of playtime. You can see the bears are very interested in the cameras. And then we also have an example of some first steps towards climbing. My understanding is that this was this cub's sort of first try at climbing, and so you can see that our rehab staff member was present the whole time and making sure that he wasn't going to fall and hurt himself. But then you could see those sort of play behaviors coming into play as well, where he was kind of like, oh, what are you doing? And so they were playing along with him as well.
So our next bear to come in, we call the twins because they came in together. We do believe them to be siblings. They were seen by some people who were out in the wild running around. And again, DWR, I believe, tried to get them back with their family and was unable to do so, and so brought them in. They came in a good while after OG and little OG, but significantly smaller. So about 4 pounds each, 4 to 5 pounds each. So I mean, and they had also been out in the wild with their mom a little bit longer, presumably, since they were already out of the den and seen, in the wild with her. So they came in a little bit more wild, so to speak. They weren't as attached to us, and we were able to get them, as you can see, eating out of bowls pretty immediately. We only had to bottle feed them for a few days, and they very much preferred to be treated like little bears and not treated like our little babies. So this is Lavender and Yellow now, who when they first came in, happily eating on their own.
So that tells you a little bit about the variety that we see in the cubs that come in, that they all have their own personalities and different preferences, and we will also address those different personalities later on as well.
All right, so our last bears we called the triplets, and we do believe them to be triplets. Red and white and double pink came in together, and they were seen with there was a dead sow, and they were seen with the body. And so the DW brought them in, and then someone observed the baby, who is now double blue, with the dead mother on a subsequent occasion, and so she came in as well. So there are 3 girls, coincidentally, and they came in the biggest. They were already almost 10 pounds when they came in, and they already knew that they were wild bears. They wanted nothing to do with us. So we put them through their quarantine period, gave them their own half of LMI to be quarantined in, rather than going through that Zinger and syringe feeding and bottle feeding process, and let them be bears and develop their own bear personalities.
I'll touch a little bit on the introductions, but I'll let Kavya kind of go into more detail here. But like they said, the females were housed on the other side of LMI. So LMI has 2 separated sides that have a connecting chute in the middle. And so technically there are kind of two different enclosures to LMI, but then you can take out that chute or middle section to make it one big enclosure. But you can see for quite a while we did have it as two separate enclosures because we wanted to make sure that the introduction between the male bears and the female bears went as smoothly as possible, because once again, a rehab staff member needs to be present at any sort of interacting times just to make sure that nobody gets injured, since that's of course the last thing we want while they're in our care. So on May 8th, the LMI connecting chute was made accessible to the cubs, which meant that they could go into the chute, but they couldn't go entirely onto the other side of LMI. And so they basically had opportunities to see each other and kind of smell each other. And at certain points, they could even touch each other through the kind of connecting bars and everything, but they didn't have full access to each other. But then in late May, so it took a little less than a month, but in late May, the males and females were fully introduced, of course, under supervision, but it went basically as well as we could have ever hoped for. And so at that point, they were fully allowed to interact and play with each other, which was really, really exciting.
I think the only thing to emphasize here would be the importance of the quarantine protocols that we have when it comes to introduction. So we had to keep little OG separate from big OG for that full 14 days before they could be friends. And then the twins, when they came in, we housed them in the chute, but we couldn't let them interact with OG and little until they had gone through that quarantine as well. And then around that May 8th time is when they finished their quarantine, and we were able to let them start reaching through the bars and playing with OG and Little. And then around that same time is when the triplets moved into the other side of LMI, and we had to keep it covered so that they couldn't touch any of the other four bears, and they had everything to themselves. And then again, after that 14-day period had come through, we let everyone start meeting. Luckily, by that point, OG and Little were in with the twins together. And that was something that we had to be very careful about because the twins were the smallest, and we were the most worried about making sure that they would be safe in that process and get along with everyone. And we discovered that Yellow was going to stand up to everyone, including OG in that process, and hold his own. And so once that quarantine was over, we were able to open it so that everyone could sort of reach each other. And the girls, of course, being so wild, were a little hesitant at first, but Little, being the favorite of all of the bears, went and made himself, reached out to them and tried to get to know them. And now they're all good friends.
We're mentioning this a little late, but at this point, all of the cubs have had some kind of introduction to solid food. And this is really important, again, just so they know how to find food out in the wild, but also to help wean them off of that formula, since they're all kind of in different stages at this point. But at this point, they're all weaned off of bottle feeding and that syringe feeding, but they're still getting some amount of mush bowls as well, but we're decreasing it gradually to eventually get them on to exclusively solid foods. And since black bears are omnivores, they're going to eat a very wide variety of things, pretty much anything you can think of. And so it's going to be a lot of different fruits, a lot of different vegetables, as well as nuts and animal protein. And typically the foods that are offered are going to be as seasonal as we can get them to be, because again, we want them to know and be able to identify the foods that they can eat out in the wild that are actually available in the wild. But of course, we don't necessarily have wild watermelon growing in Virginia, but I mean, how can you not give a bear a watermelon? Come on. So, but this is a good example of just sort of the variety that we give the bear cubs. And so you can see all the different fruits and vegetables, and you can see some hard-boiled eggs as well, and then some little mealworms for that animal protein, since actually a sort of misconception about black bears is that they're, really big, scary predators, that they, of course, have those hunting abilities and very much physically have the means to do harm to smaller animals. But typically they're going to be more opportunistic and just sort of foraging based. And this, of course, depends on the time of year, but really the most hunting that they're going to do is kind of fishing in a way. So they're going to be eating a lot of bugs more than, any substantially sized animal of any kind. Like they don't, hunt deer or anything like that. again, they're opportunistic, so they'll consume the things that they can really get a hold of, but they're going to mostly forage versus seeking out prey, kind of. Going back to just sort of that introduction, that these solid foods are initially going to be introduced chopped up into small pieces just to make it a little more palatable for them, but then they will eventually just get the entire food, and they kind of have to work and figure out how to break it up and eat it on their own, since again that's what they would do in the wild. And these foods are also provided in ways that are going to encourage those natural foraging behaviors. And so a lot of the time we're going to maybe bury food in some type of substrate, so they have to dig for it, or we'll put it in different spots in the enclosure to encourage them to explore to find the food. And we definitely don't just put it in a bowl in front of them and say, there you go, there's your food. That it's a little more interactive than that and requires a little more brain power and problem solving skills. And these are just some kind of highlights from their time in LMI. And so I think this is also a good sort of example of the enrichment that's provided, that enrichment for the cubs and pretty much any animal that's going to be in our care, but the cubs especially, enrichment is just part of the daily husbandry. That it's pretty much everything that the rehabilitation team is doing is some form of enrichment. And so that can just be simple enclosure setup. So providing those climbing surfaces for them to explore, but then also, maybe some fun activities, like we gave them a couple of bubble baths sometimes, which, serves more of a purpose than just look at these cute bear cubs in a bubble bath, that it actually helps them make the connection of swimming to find food and encouraging those swimming behaviors, so they can catch fish and that sort of thing. So it's making sure that they know that they can swim as well, but it's also just really cute to give them a bubble bath. And that was also with animal safe bubbles, and I think they were blue raspberry scented, something like that, right?
Yeah, something like that.
But they had a fun little scent, and it was a cute little activity, but it was again to encourage those natural behaviors that they need for when they go back into the wild. And then you can see that we have those large stuffed animals for them that kind of mimics the mother being around, obviously not in the way of action, but in terms of just having that soft sort of thing for them to kind of snuggle up to if they need that. And then we also did some little activities, like this is frozen broth cubes. So just putting some broth in the freezer and then giving it to them, and you can see that they just absolutely went to town with those, that they loved those. And then inevitably, I've been told that every single year the bear cubs do manage to get a hold of a broom while the rehab team is trying to clean the enclosure. And so this is one of the bears looking like it's helping and brooming. And, as ridiculous as that may seem, that is also a form of enrichment, that it's just something different, something to break up the day. So this is kind of what life looked like in LMI for the cubs. And then for the black bear complex, I'm mentioning this now because at this point we are prepping the black bear complex and making sure that it is ready for the cubs to move into eventually. And this is really just a half-acre sort of fenced-in area on the Wildlife Center's property, and this cubs are typically going to be moved here when they are at least larger than 10 kilograms. So they have to hit that 10 kilogram mark before they're able to go into the black bear complex, just for safety concerns, really, because there's of course lots of trees they can climb. They can get very high up, but then also, this is really the best place for them to be for the rest of the duration of their stay at the center, because this is going to solidify those natural behaviors and everything like that. And so, like I said, it's a half-acre of land that they have all to themselves. And so it has lots and lots of trees, but it also has lots of burrow areas and, sort of artificial structures as well. So we have some hammocks set up there, but then we also provide, lots of water sources, both artificial and natural. So they have a nice variety of things available in the complex. And this is where they're going to live until the following spring when they are released. by June, the smallest cubs, so the twins, they were both large enough where it was kind of starting to be more of a safety concern to be able to weigh them every single week. So we took those final weights on those smallest cubs on June 3rd, and then at this point, all of the cubs have been weaned off the mush bowls as well, and so that means that they are only eating solid foods. They are still chopped up a little bit, but they are on solid foods entirely and self-feeding. And then these are just some photos of other members of our rehab team just preparing the black bear complex and making sure that everything was safe and ready to go for the cubs. So you can see we're testing the hammocks, we're testing some of the swings and everything. And so you can see that they had lots of fun with that was a nice little break almost for them. And then in July, they had their bye-bye LMI party. So it was basically just a big celebration with lots of streamers and just all sorts of fun going on to say goodbye to the LMI. And then on 2 consecutive days, the males were moved and then the females were moved. And so this goes over the actual process, which Kavya will be able to speak to more than I can.
Right. So this and our fawn release are probably the 2 most staff-intensive procedures that we will go through at the Wildlife Center every year. So this was weeks in the making of going into Black Bear Complex, walking it by hand, making sure all the perimeter fences were secure, making sure that all of the electric fences were secure, making sure that those visual barriers that we have so that they're never seeing us walking around the fence and things like that were intact and there weren't any trees that they could escape or anything like that. And then the veterinary team at the same time is busy looking at the weights that we have on them, preparing the medication protocols that they're going to use to sedate them, figuring out the staffing and the team members. And then on these 2 different days, all of the veterinary staff essentially and all of the rehabilitation staff went in to get these bears ready to move into LMI. So we had 1 veterinarian along with a rehabilitation person slated to get the bears sedated because, as Allison stated, until the bears are 100% sedated, we don't let any team member who wasn't part of that 4 core team members be around the bears. And that once they're fully sedated, they go through a whole nother full exam. We did a second round of prophylactic deworming just in case they had picked anything up. We put on the permanent ear tags that you guys are seeing on the cameras so that we would be able to identify them without having to be up close to them. And then we got them moved over into the bear complex where they live now, and then monitored to make sure they would recover okay from the anesthesia, and then monitored really closely those first few days on the camera to make sure that they were going to be able to do well in that black bear complex with all of those new, especially being able to get really high up in a tree. And yeah, it's an intensive procedure. As you can see, it takes a whole lot of people, but it's also, a lot of fun and a really big accomplishment when we get to move the bears out there.
Things kind of progress a little quickly at this point because really the big goal is getting the bears out into the yard, and once they're out there, it is pretty much hands off at that point. That they of course still need to be fed, and so food is dropped in various different locations in the yard, but otherwise, they're really having very little to ideally no social interaction with humans at all, and they're really spending just all of their time together. And so they are at this point very much solidifying that they are bears, and they are solidifying those wild tendencies that they have and all those natural behaviors that we want to see. And so between July and November, which is now, they were receiving increasing amounts of food, and it got up to as high as 200 pounds of food in just a single day that they were given. And that is because of something called hyperphagia, which is basically just an increased appetite to build those fat reserves for winter, since that sort of hibernation process is very important for bears. And so they basically just get super, super hungry when the winter is coming, and they're like, I need to eat everything. And so they were getting lots and lots of food to satisfy their appetite. But now that we are very, very close to winter, their appetite is coming back down. And so at this point, they're getting closer to about 150 pounds of food a day. At this point, it is decreasing pretty much each day. And so moving on to personalities, this is going to be all Kavya, that this is going to be their personal experience with each bear and just kind of what they've observed. But you'll be able to kind of catch these personality glimpses if you tune into our critter cams on our website as well.
Like Allison said, I'm sure you guys are getting to know all of the individual bears based on being able to see them live every day in the bear yard. But we just wanted to share, since you guys have been watching them all season, what it's like to get to know each of these bears individually. So as I stated, Double Green, or OG as we call him, he was the one who sort of most thought of us as moms, having come in and been alone with us at the beginning. And he also very quickly became the most dominant bear, especially when it became to food, particularly grapes and nuts. Those are all OGs if he finds them, except for the yellowed ear-tagged twin. Yellow, for some reason, was always willing to stand up to OG and take whatever he wanted, and OG would actually back off. So, but OG is very respected in our bear society, and he's always the first to come over when we come to drop the food in and see what we're doing and follow along with what all of our activities, as well as see what the best little bits are when we're visiting them every day. Little OG, or a double orange, is the most social of our group of bears. As I said before, he was the first bear to go and meet the triplets and introduce himself, and he's still the bear that you will see on camera playing with absolutely everyone. He really likes to play with the twins, he really likes to play with OG, and he even will spend time with the triplets, despite them being slightly more aloof sometimes. So he's always been a very cuddly, very loving bear. He also really likes lettuce, as you can see him here. Every time he finds one, he freaks out and immediately starts ripping it up. So the twins are the two bears that came in the smallest, and you can see Lavender here looking quite big, though he stayed the smallest through the whole rehabilitation process. And Yellow here looking at, initially they refused to eat fish or really any kind of animal proteins that we would give them that were whole, and so I tried tying a chunk of fish to like a vine and moving it around, and they still did not. They ate the vine. So we decided to make Lavender because they looked very similar when they both came in, and so Lavender we were actually differentiating with purple nail polish on her ears, which she always managed to get off. But she's also the most different looking now because she's always had a very, very dark face. So we can tell from a distance which one she is because of that. And they also have their little food preferences. Yellow, when he's fighting with OG, it's because he wants melon. That's always been his favorite, especially honeydew melons. And the triplets are the last little group of bears as we think of them when we're working with them. They're the sisters who came in last, and they came in already wild. They could fully climb. They weren't falling over or stumbling over anything when we let them get into LMI. And when we put them into Black Bear Complex, they were the first ones to start climbing trees. And actually, as of a couple days ago, they were the first ones to discover the little dens that we have built in. No one else had used them until the triplets did the day before yesterday. They're also a little bit more adult in their outside behaviors. They'll actually eat their vegetables, especially corn and peppers. And as you can see, this little curve here, red and white, is very dainty. She always likes to eat her food off of her paw like it's a little plate in front of her. I don't have a photo of Blue here just for space, but she's also the other bear that's very easy to distinguish, but from a distance, because she almost looks like a sun bear. She has a lot of fur on the back of her head, and she's got a white blaze on the front of her neck. So those three are a little bit more aloof from the other bears, though it's really fun with this group because all 7 of them, they're generally always together. But the 3 triplets are definitely always together, and Lavender often hangs out with them as well.
This is the fun part. This is just a bunch of cute pictures of the bears, basically, that we don't have tons more information to really share. But these are some snapshots of them actually out in the Black Bear Complex in the bear yard. So we can see some big stretches. We can see tree time. And that's a nighttime shot, actually, of them just kind of snoozing away. And then we, of course, still provide little things to sort of just up the enrichment factor for them, so that a lot of the time even just takes form in giving them their food inside their boxes, or even just giving them the box. It doesn't even have to have food in it. And you can see that they absolutely love that. And then here's some additional photos. So this is a nice little sky view that I think I love that photo in particular. And then again, just more tree time, just lots of eating. I wanted to include this picture specifically because that is one of the little stuffies that they had when they were in LMI that kind of acted as like a mom figure, sort of tactile sensation for them. And we just got a really funny picture of them driving the cart that we have at the center with all the bear supplies in the back, and I just thought it's a silly picture. And then I think these are probably some of the best shots of them, and also the most recent as well. And so you can see that they are just balancing on those thin tree branches, and you best believe all of our Critter Cam moderated discussion viewers are all saying, oh my gosh, I'm getting so nervous with that bear up in that tree. And it's always very nerve-wracking for anybody watching, but they're doing great. Like I've never seen them fall. If they have a little slip up, they catch themselves. I mean, they are bears at this point, that they have a pretty good handle on things for the most part. And you can see that they're all kind of grouped together here, that like Kavya mentioned, they really a lot of the time do stick together, and just kind of lounging. And then another little aerial view. That is pretty much everything that we have to share with you in terms of the presentation. And so now we can take questions if anybody has them. So the question is, will the cubs continue to interact with each other once they are released back into the wild, or will they become solitary? And I'll let Kavya answer this one.
Sure. So this being my first year, I can't speak to what previous bears that were released specifically did, but I do know that DWR does monitor them after they're released. That's why they change the tags, but they leave them tagged bears. But I do know as well that the process by which we release them is organized by DWR, and it's sort of based on us being able to get them into traps and based on the space and the transport and all of that. So we're not going to release all 7 of them together, most likely. I think they do try to release not just one bear at any one place. And typically my understanding is that it's sort of like in the wild, where what the siblings will stay with mom, and then mom will leave the babies at some point usually, and then the babies will, being basically bears at that point, spend a certain amount of time together, and then generally they'll naturally disperse. They sort of are semi-social in that they might encounter each other at different feeding locations. They might seek each other out or spend more time together, but for the most part, outside of mating season in the wild, they are solitary. So our expectation is that it'll be similar to that, where they'll get released in sort of groupings, and then they'll sort of do what they want, which will end in them naturally separating.
So the question is, where are the bears released? And sort of just echoing what Kavya said, and then we sort of briefly touched on this in the presentation as well, but the release is entirely coordinated by the Department of Wildlife Resources, and so it's really just wherever they deem is going to be the best habitat for them. And typically the sort of things that they look for when they're selecting those release locations are going to be definitely not very many humans around, as well as not any other bears that they can identify in the area, so there isn't as much competition for resources. But past those sort of qualifications, in a way, it's really any part of Virginia is fair game as a release site. So it's all over the state. So the question is, do all bears hibernate? And if you want, you can touch on this one, Kavya.
Yes. So hibernation in mammals is very temperature dependent. So all bears can hibernate, and if it got cold enough, our bears might hibernate, but typically Virginia doesn't get cold enough that they do. So we feed our bears all year round, and my understanding is that typically they haven't hibernated with us. They might not show up to certain meals. If it gets really cold, we might not see them as frequently, but we keep feeding them all year round, and they don't tend to, bears in Virginia in general don't tend to hibernate.
Do you know if that's the case out in the wild as well?
In the wild as well. So when we talk about early in the season we can reunite them. It's more because the mothers will have the babies and they won't leave the den while the babies are too small, not necessarily because they're asleep, but just because they can't leave the babies. And so that's a time frame when we're able to find them. But again, if it gets cold enough, any of them can and will hibernate. It just generally does not, and is less likely to do so, I guess.
When will we release them? So we are going to release them in the spring. I know that a lot of sort of tests and things need to be done before they can really be good to go for release. But typically, do you remember when the release was this year, Kavya?
Last season, DWR reached out around the end of March, and I believe it was one group was released right at the end of March and one group was released in the first days of April. We actually had a couple of bears who were just refusing to go, and so there was a good distance between those releases. And yeah, like Allison said, again, we'll fully sedate the bears and they'll go through a whole other exam procedure and all of that, the same tests that they got on intake and before moving into the bear complex to ensure that they're really, really healthy before they get released.
Yeah, and just to reemphasize, that release process is entirely on the Department of Wildlife Resources. So we just give them their exams and make sure that they are in fact ready to go. But once they are deemed ready to go, we don't really see the release ourselves, unfortunately, which is a little sad, but that's also the safest thing to do, of course. And so the Department of Wildlife Resources is going to take them to their release location and then actually release them. And then they will also be checking up on them and making sure that those individuals are doing well out in the wild, for sure. So the question was, can you all see the release on our critter cams? And unfortunately, you all won't be able to see the release on the critter cams. Occasionally, the people that are doing the release from the Department of Wildlife Resources, they do occasionally take videos and share them with us. But for the most part, they are just focused on getting the bears out as safely as possible, since it is, as we've well established at this point, it's very much a safety consideration doing anything with the bears, especially once they are at that fully grown size for the most part. So unfortunately, there aren't really any opportunities for us, but as well as you guys, to see the release itself, which is sad, but that's just the reality of it, and we have to take everybody's consideration into mind first thing. So what are the predators of a bear? I'll let Kavya answer this one.
Humans. Yeah. It's not a predator, but the other thing that will most commonly kill a bear, other than like a car or a hunter, is mange. So the Wildlife Center of Virginia has actually been very involved in studies on the specific type of, it's called ursotopic, the specific type of mange that bears get that was causing a significant increase in bear mortality a few years ago, and it's really helped DWR in understanding the disease processes there. And those levels are going down in the wild as well, thanks to a lot of DWR's work in monitoring. But generally, it's going to be disease, particularly mange, or human beings.
The question is just about our individual backgrounds. So my background is that I studied conservation biology when I was in college. I went to George Mason University up in Fairfax, and I was also really fortunate to be able to do a program sort of in collaboration with the Smithsonian. And so I actually spent about a year at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute site in Front Royal, and I was able to learn kind of firsthand from a lot of conservation professionals and learn about all sorts of different opportunities that there are in the conservation world. And so that was a really valuable experience for me, for sure, that anybody that is able to do that program, I really highly recommend it, because it was the highlight of my college career, I would say. But after I finished that program, I did graduate, and then I did an internship with basically a zoo facility working on animal wellness. So I was very focused on zoo animals in particular, but I did that internship and I just really felt more fascinated by local wildlife, and I grew up in Northern Virginia, so I am very much connected to Virginia wildlife, and I had looked up to the Wildlife Center for a long time, specifically because I had done another internship with a small songbird rehabilitation center in Northern Virginia, and so I saw a job posting for the Wildlife Center and I applied, and that's basically what brought me there. So I'm really glad that I get to just help educate people on the importance of wildlife every day, that I'm really passionate about the work that I'm able to do, thankfully.
I have a little bit more of a non-traditional background. I actually came to Virginia for law school, and I am a lawyer by training. I went to law school to practice animal rights law, and then while I was in law school, I heard of Rockfish Wildlife Sanctuary and decided to go there and try working hands-on with wildlife, doing their rehabilitation internship, and just loved it. And continued through a year and a half of legal practice to do wildlife rehabilitation on the side, and I volunteered at the Wildlife Center of Virginia while I was finishing law school. So I decided to go into wildlife rehabilitation full time and was excited for the opportunity to come and do that at the Wildlife Center this year.
Yeah, just to sort of follow up on that, I definitely would not say there is a typical experience that anybody has that brings them to the Wildlife Center, at least among our staff, that we all come from such varied backgrounds, which all in all is a really good thing because we're able to get so many different perspectives and life experiences that go into the work that we do. So regardless of the path of how any of us got there, we have a really awesome team that does really, really great work with a lot of different backgrounds, of course. So the question is just regarding black bear populations in Virginia, and Kavya, you might be a little more suited to answer this because I know that we have plenty of black bears. I just don't know exact population estimates, but do you happen to know, Kavya?
Yeah. I don't know offhand. It's definitely something I should know. I will say that DWR does pretty close monitoring of the population of black bears in the state and have been for a really long time. So I definitely know that they have those statistics, and I believe they're publicly available.
So are there other species at the center, or is it just black bears? We do have any species that is native to Virginia in our care. So that is what we are authorized to rehabilitate. So we are the only facility in Virginia that can rehabilitate black bears, but we also rehabilitate anything that is native to Virginia with a select few exceptions, that there are some regulations on adult white-tailed deer as well as coyotes. So there are some little intricacies there that we have to sort of work around sometimes, but otherwise we can treat anything that's native to the state. All right. Well, thank you so much for having us.